Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave, your speakeasy for ideas, where Tom and Dave show us how to think like the American founders. Grab a drink if you'd like. The conversation about saving our republic is about to begin.
Well, Dave, when you look through history, which we tend to do a lot, in Vino and Veritas Society, we think there are important lessons to be learned from history. You see all kinds of high, tragedies and triumphs and great dramas, and then occasionally we have modern American elections. We have our politics today. It's not quite the same as some of the high, great dramas and triumphs and tragedies, but still, it's important. I mean, elections do matter. Elections have results, and we just had some important elections. Were you watching them?
Unfortunately, I was. A lot to take away. There's a lot of takeaways from the election yesterday. I think the first thing you have to talk about, just elephant in the room. We've already seen it. It's already being pushed, especially on platforms like True Social, and we know where that voice is coming from.
Right. I'm
struggling to buy into any of these theories about election fraud this time around. We're still hearing some, and we saw some issues with voting machines in Maricopa County, which shock of the world, right?
Yeah.
Maricopa County does not seem to be able to get their act together in terms of voting. And if anybody was paying attention, there was about 20% of the machines broke early in the day yesterday, and they were transferring ballots and this and that. They seem to have gotten it worked out. There has been a lawsuit filed by Kari Lake and Blake Masters against the county, the state, and in large part, that's really because Kari Lake's opponent, Katie Hobbs from Arizona, who's running for governor as a Democrat, also happens to be Secretary of State. So it's a little uncomfortable. But beyond that,
well, I was going to say I heard my old friend Dinesh D'Souza, who I've known since the mid 1990s, and Dinesh is heavily invested in this whole subject. He has a movie out there, 2000 Mules. I believe that has just now come out as in book form.
Mm-hmm.
And I caught a little bit of Dinesh the other day on the radio, and he was making an interesting distinction between voter fraud versus election fraud. Voter fraud, he accounts for an individual. Maybe an individual has changed residences 2 or 3 times recently and gets ballots sent to everyone, and so that person thinks, "Hey, I'll go vote, 2 or 3 times." That's voter fraud. That's usually not sufficient to change, election results. The bigger problem is structural, organized election fraud. And he was making the point, and this is coming from Dinesh. This is someone who's acutely aware of what's been going on. He was saying, I don't think there's going to be really any of it because everyone is now tuned into it. Everyone is aware of it. Everyone's watching and paying so close attention. And I think he's probably right about that.
Well, and take it a step further. If there was election fraud, the people this time were pretty brash, right? This wasn't a data dump at night when nobody's watching. This wasn't hey, we're going to add 10,000 votes like he like his 2000 Mules argued that they were stuffing ballot boxes with a few thousand extra votes. There was the accusations 2 years ago about trucks backing up with more votes. We're seeing defeats in some of these elections that we thought were going to be close, by thousands or hundreds of thousands rather of votes, right? Lee Zeldin is the perfect example. I had real high hopes for Lee Zeldin. I like him as a politician. I like him as a thoughtful human being. I think his priorities are right.
I'm just chuckling because those two things don't often go together. Politician and thoughtful human being.
I think Lee Zeldin would have been very, very good for New York. I think what he did in Congress was very good. And it wasn't close, right? We were thinking this is neck and neck. People were even talking about this is a no-brainer. I mean, Kathy Hochul was posing with Mark Ruffalo the day before the election, who's now a vocal Holocaust denier, right? In a extremely Jewish state, one of the few states where the Jewish vote actually has impact. and Mark Ruffalo, who sits out there and says the Holocaust never happened.
Wait, I don't know about
Oh,
this.
really?
So the Incredible Hulk
Yes.
is now out there denying the Holocaust.
He is a follower of the Black Hebrew Israelite movement. He is a big proponent of the BDS movement. He is everything is free Palestine, which we had this conversation after your concert the other night.
Yeah.
And he said, I don't believe that the Holocaust happened.
Oh, goodness. Well,
and she's out there posing with him, and Lee Zeldin's a Jew, right? Lee Zeldin is one of my people, and he's out there. Is Lee Zeldin the perfect candidate for somebody like you and I who want true freedom, true liberty? No, but in a state that leans the way the way New York does,
right?
Lee Zeldin is almost a better version of old Rudy Giuliani, right? He's likable, he's thoughtful, he prioritized crime and inflation and trying to make New York City livable again. I think we've talked about this in the past. Outside of my time in Colorado, I've lived mostly in New York and Florida.
Mm-hmm.
I love New York City. It happens. I'm one of the few. I mean, right? You have two different types of people in this world. You either love New York or you hate New York.
Right.
I happen to love living in New York City. New York City is not a livable city right now. People are fleeing. I think that had a lot to do with the results. We should do a little postmortem here and I'll get to that. But the migration from New York to Florida, we saw in the results of Lee Zeldin versus Ron DeSantis. Mm-hmm. But overall, these were not races that were so-and-so won by 10,000 votes, 9,000 votes, 15. We're talking 200,000-300,000 vote differences. And I just don't think it's reasonable to make an argument in really any of these cases, other than potentially Arizona, that some kind of shenanigans went on.
Well, so let's back up here and let me just ask you in big general way, what were some of your key takeaways from this election?
I think the hardest part for a lot of people to admit and has to be said is there was a large referendum on Trump in this election. Yep. It's impossible to ignore that Trump was still on the ballot, which you've pointed out to me before, and you can expand on if you want to. It's very odd to have somebody who's not in office, mm-hmm. not running for an office,
right,
have such a huge impact. I mean,
his name appeared on no ballot anywhere in the United States, and yet this name, this presence is all over on both sides, right? There are people, they're voting for certain politicians because of Trump, and others are voting against a politician because of Trump. Some are voting because they love Trump, and some are voting because they hate Trump.
Yeah.
But it's like we can't have a conversation about anything else or other individual politicians because it's Trump.
And he inserted himself in this election.
Yeah.
He made a point. Now, he did some things that really upset people. I think we've talked about him. I'll mention him again in a minute. But overall, this was a referendum on Trump in a lot of ways. The two major things for Democrats on the ballot were, one, Roe v. Wade and abortion, and two, Donald Trump. And the proof in the pudding with Trump is outside of Arizona, where we still don't really know what's going on. And we have some friends who have moved to Arizona. We've heard that there has been this groundswell of they want to be Trump country.
Right.
But outside of that, every Trump candidate they got demolished in these elections. We're gonna have a runoff in Georgia, mm-hmm. but you look at the difference. Brian Kemp, the governor, Brian Kemp's just Brian Kemp. He talks about Trump, the good things Trump did, and he talks about the bad things Trump did. Brian Kemp beats Stacey Abrams to the point that she actually said, yes, I concede, I lost. Yep. Who would have ever in a million years thought that Stacey Abrams would concede an election and not say this is because of Jim Crow 2.0, not say this is because of voter laws or I'm black and a woman and you don't like me because of that. No, she conceded the election, which was shocking. And in that same state where Brian Kemp was able to beat Stacey Abrams, who, by the way, I mean, look, I do not like Stacey Abrams, but Stacey Abrams is a more competent candidate than Raphael Warnock, right? Than Herschel Walker's opponent. Right. And Walker still couldn't pace Brian Kemp. So Walker is points behind Kemp to the point that it's looking like a runoff. Everybody knows we film these a little bit in advance. It's Wednesday morning here. So we're still waiting, but it's looking more and more like a runoff. But get out of those. Mehmet Oz was a big Trump guy, right? Sure. Trump pushed him over the finish line, although there's a lot of theories that the Republican or the Democrats put a lot of money into getting Oz over. He ran against a fairly competent opponent in the primary.
And those two things are likely connected,
sure.
Right? I mean, certainly there's no question Trump got behind Oz, and that likely is precisely why Democrats would want Oz as their opponent,
right.
Because he's so connected to Trump.
And the fact that Oz loses to John Fetterman, and you know what? We can talk about all we want, the issues of the stroke, and he's not he's not persuasive, he's not
right.
But then look at his record. He's been lieutenant governor in a state that's struggled for years, where the economy is not good across Pennsylvania.
Right.
He was the mayor of a town that when you interview people in that town, they said it's a wasteland. He destroyed the town. This guy had no record at all to run on.
Yep.
And yet Oz was such a bad candidate that and with the Trump brand on him, he lost, and he lost bad. The next one we go to Herschel Walker, right? We was talking about Warnock earlier. Herschel Walker could not track Kemp. Arizona was the exception. And on top of all of that, you've got Bullock up in North Carolina, or in New Hampshire, rather. Bullock is this guy who the Democrats admittedly poured a lot of money in to try to make sure he won the primary because they thought he would be easily beatable. And the Republican Party was so convinced that this guy could win his race, and Bullock got just destroyed. So this was a referendum on Trump. And at the same time, Ron DeSantis won by leaps and bounds. I mean, he won counties that Republicans haven't won in 30 plus years.
Right.
He got huge swaths of the Hispanic vote for the first that Republicans have never gotten in Florida. I mean, this was an absolute statement about how much people in Florida love Ron DeSantis.
So Dave, let me just ask you here a really pointed question. In your opinion, what does this election mean for Donald Trump?
Donald Trump needs to think about stepping away. It's as simple as that. And we've tried to be very fair to Donald Trump. You know, we have members who listen, who absolutely love him.
Yep.
We have members who listen who really don't like him. Here's what I'm going to say about Donald Trump, and I'd love to hear where you stand on this comment. Donald Trump was the right person at the right time in 2016. Did I like him? Was it the person I really wanted to vote for? Right. No, but we couldn't get Hillary. We couldn't allow Hillary in office. And when I compared Donald Trump to the previous generation of Republican candidates, McCain, Romney, Bush, Bush Sr., these are not liberty-minded Republicans. These were far from liberty-minded people. They wanted big government solutions.
In fact, I'm going to, maybe, I don't know, pushback's too strong, emphasize something different. Because there's a big government streak in Trump too.
Without a doubt.
And Trump loves to spend money on, his pet projects. He loves to spend other people's money. I think the bigger difference is all those names you just listed, those old kind of establishment Republicans, they're sort of milquetoast. They're kind of soft. They are not street brawlers.
Right.
They're not fighters. They want to continue to be invited to the posh, upscale cocktail parties in Washington and New York and other places, and they want to be seen as respectable. So they're not going to be brash, they're not going to be loud, they're not going to be outrageous and in your face. That's what Trump was. And I think that's precisely why a lot of Americans voted for him, because they want a fighter. They are tired of being many conservatives and liberty-minded citizens. They're tired of decades of being bullied and being denounced and being called you're bad and you're selfish and you're greedy and you're racist and you hate women and a lot of Americans are like, no, I'm none of those things. I'm just trying to live, man. I'm just trying to run my business and raise my family. That's it. And so they want to bully on their side. And Trump came along in 2016 and said, yeah, I'll punch right back.
Right.
One of these progressive journalists, says something bad about me, I'm going to say something bad about him right back.
Without a doubt. You're 100% right. I think we've talked about on the podcast, and this could be something if anybody wants to have the conversation with me. I wrote an article years ago. This was 2017, right after the inauguration, about Trump being a character from a John Hughes film. And I compared him quite a bit to Emilio Estevez in Breakfast Club.
Yeah.
I don't want to get into that today, but if anybody ever is curious, I'm happy to have that conversation about sort of that analogy I made.
Right.
But when you're talking about big government and use of government, I think Trump used government in a different way. He wasn't a small government freedom guy in the way we wanted him to be, but he was also different from the Bush, Romney, McCain types. Bush, Romney, and McCain knew how to intentionally use the government to control things and benefit certain interests in a way that they did it with purpose. I think some of the things Trump is just a product of, look, the guy was a longtime Democrat. He was a longtime progressive. He's used government benefits to build all of his empire of real estate. He has taken tax breaks. He has negotiated deals. He's bribed politicians. We know he's done all of that. I don't think Trump went in thinking, here's a problem and I'm going to look for a government solution to fix it because I believe that government should solve all of our problems. I think it was just sort of natural inclination. We need to fix this and people are going to like me and vote for me if I do. So some of it was kind of fly by the seat of his pants.
Right.
Whereas I think when you look at things like McCain-Feingold, that was intentionally designed to build a bigger, more powerful government.
Yep. Yeah, I agree with you. He's no ideological progressive or he's no dogmatic progressive. He's kind of a progressive big spender by default.
Right.
And it's not very purposeful. It's not very conscious. It's not very principled. But we still look at it in 2016. Some 65, 70 million voting Americans said this guy will fight for me.
Right.
And he's going to punch back and he's our guy. And so he instantly rises up as the sort of iconic brand of what it means to be a Republican, the whole, MAGA, make America great again, all of that. And there seemed to be some coattails for a while.
Yeah.
His endorsement seemed to matter. And if I'm hearing you correctly, I think you're suggesting here in late 2022, things have really changed. And his endorsement is arguably more of a liability than an asset. Without a doubt.
And I think we saw that, like I said, across the board, all of the candidates who he really got behind. And you look at somebody, I think the perfect example is somebody like J.D. Vance in Ohio. I don't know if anybody's read Hillbilly Elegy, if you've read the book, but it's a memoir of his life. And he comes from very humble beginnings in Ohio, single mom household, and really struggled in the early days of his life, and works his way up from being this sort of hillbilly Midwesterner to getting into Yale and having to work through it. It's a little bit of an academic version of Rudy, if that makes any sense. But it's a true story about this guy's life. And J.D. Vance started by embracing Trump. early in his campaign. And Trump said, go tell McConnell off. I don't want you. You're going to tell McConnell you're against him and all of these things. And then when it got close at the end, JD Vance goes to Trump and says, you have $100 million war chest. I need help. Trump said, I'll come campaign for you, but my endorsement should be enough. If you can't win with just my endorsement, you're not good enough.
Right.
And guess who comes to his rescue? Mitch McConnell. And JD Vance distances himself from Trump at the end. McConnell comes in, spends the money, helps support him, and JD Vance won pretty handily. So we saw a lot of these races where people were very much not in the Trump camp, to the point that you almost wonder what the comment, Trump made that comment the other day about Ron DeSantis, right? He called him Ron DeSanctimonious.
Yeah.
I almost wonder if that helped. I almost wonder if at that point, and then Trump this morning doubled down and he says, look, I voted for Ron DeSantis. He's done a great job for Florida and he needs to sit there for another 4 years and be governor because if he runs against me, I'm going to destroy him. And it's just not the way this needs to go. And if I were somebody like Herschel Walker, who there's looking like a runoff like we had 2 years ago for that seat, I'd probably ask Trump to stay away. And I would probably be on the phone with Ron DeSantis right now saying, hey, will you come help me?
Right.
Because it just doesn't make sense.
So one big kind of takeaway from this election is Trump's influence has certainly diminished as a big player in national politics and our political culture. His days might really be numbered. They might be over. I'm not sure.
They might be. He's going to probably announce that he's running, but I saw a lot of Republicans get very, very upset with him over things. The second big takeaway is, well, one that we haven't talked much about over the years doing this is polling. Polling was terrible this year. I think we reached a point that you don't even talk about polling anymore. There's no sense in even looking at it.
And is that because so many citizens feel uncomfortable being truthful with pollsters? Is that the sort of core problem, or is it something else?
I actually think it's part of this whole pull to the extremes within the parties. Most people don't answer their phone if they don't know the number. I think that's just a fact today. Right. So you're not getting really good samples. And the people who look for opportunities to participate in a poll are very strongly opinionated. I participated in a handful of polls this year. I wasn't afraid to say what I believe, but most people, I think, answer I don't know if they even participate if they're not really on that extreme.
I think you're making a great point. You know, there were some famous episodes in the early stages of public opinion surveys. I'm going all the way back to the 1930s and 40s, and so some sort of famous examples of what I want to say, bias and skewing. You know, for example, they did like some early telephone polls, polling by telephone at a time where most people didn't have phones. You had to be, I'm going way, way back, many decades ago, you had to be fairly well off, fairly wealthy to have a telephone, right? So right there, your whole sample is very skewed. In a similar way today, you know, now we've had decades where telephones became very common in the house, a landline, the phone would ring. By the way, here's just on a lighter note, my parents, who are still both alive, they still live in the same house I grew up in. They still have hanging on their wall in the kitchen the same analog rotary dial phone that I had when I was a kid. So, and they refuse to, they don't want to learn new technology or anything. So when their phone rings, they have no idea who's calling, right? It's just ringing and they have to answer it. But think of that world when everyone had those kinds of phones. You didn't know who it was. You picked up. And you might find yourself, you know, talking to someone, hey, we're doing a quick poll. Would you answer a few questions? Now, right, everybody has a smartphone. Everybody knows who's calling.
Right.
I think you're pointing to something really important. Most people, they don't want to be bothered with a poll or a survey. They're busy doing other things. Who will take the time to answer a political survey? Someone who's really interested in politics. So it's going to tend to be these outliers.
And for this year, we've always experienced that most Republicans for the last few cycles have been hesitant to say anything. There was always a fear about being out there and being this fighting back Republican.
Yeah.
Trump did defeat that. Trump killed that feeling for a lot of people. And I want to give him credit there as well. And in 2016, if you were not a progressive, you often felt bullied and harassed, and the people who were talking to you were often smug and kind of obnoxious about it. And you just kind of sat back and said, okay, I'm not picking this fight.
Mm-hmm.
Trump made people feel better about that. This goes back to that article and just this idea that he was the bigger bully on the street who was willing to come in and say, hey, you're picking on my little brother. I'm not going to have it anymore.
Right.
And he gave people that sense of comfort in saying, I can do this too. And that's where you get a Ron DeSantis. That's where you get some of these guys saying, hey, you're not going to push us around anymore. We're not just going to listen to you belittle us.
But by the way, I should add here, in a way, this is closely related to our work, the work you and I do. It's not so much that we're anyone's bullies, but we certainly are out there showing liberty-minded Americans you can support freedom and property and equal protections of the laws and limited constitutional government, these kinds of ideas. And that doesn't mean you're stupid.
Right.
It doesn't mean there's something to be ashamed of. Just the opposite. It means you're on the side of wisdom, the side of intelligence.
Take that a step further. We've consistently encouraged our members to say to people who are harming others, that's shameful.
Yeah, right.
You think your bill that's going to do this and this and this that we all know from experience, like the war on drugs and the war on poverty, is actually going to hurt people in the long run.
Right.
That's shameful. You should don't come at me, and don't come at me telling me that I'm a bad person.
Right.
Look at what you've done for the last 40 years in this country, 50 years in this country. That is shameful, and have some conviction in understanding that. So Trump encouraged a lot of people to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that affected polling this time around too. I think people became more comfortable. We used to see Republicans did not want to talk about their opinions on polls, and I think they've started to become more comfortable, or wanting to even more so than they used to the point that the polls might have reversed this time. All of these polls, things might be a little closer.
Right.
We might have had more Republicans than Democrats sitting there saying, I want to stop and clarify one thing. I continue to say we when I'm talking about the Republican Party, and this is going to get us into our next issue that I think we should probably spend the remaining time on. And that is, I still see myself as a part of the Republican Party. I've never hidden that. But the Republican Party, to me, has failed in a lot of ways. It's not the party I want it to be. I still want to identify with the origins of the Republican Party, the party that was about defending the foundations of the United States. I know there's a lot of debate among certain groups on our side that talk about was Lincoln good or was Lincoln bad? You know, you and I both really think that Lincoln was an unbelievable president for us and did some incredibly important things.
By the way, there's a great book that kind of summarizes a lot of those fights. It's titled Vindicating Lincoln by a guy named Krannawitter. And I joke about that, although people should go out to Amazon and buy it. But one of the main topics that runs throughout my book are these kind of libertarian type critiques of Lincoln. And, so you do have people out there who say we stand for liberty and freedom and the principles of the founding, who despise Abraham Lincoln. Right.
And I think there's a really interesting opportunity, and this will get us into this next conversation. But for libertarians to take a hard look at that and decide, are we really sure that that's the hill that we want to die on? Is this really the argument we want to make? And we've talked about, I've been going through Elmer's book on Jaffa, The Soul of Politics.
Yeah.
And seeing how Jaffa describes Lincoln and the evolution of his thought of Lincoln is just so fascinating to me and so important. And yet I sit back and I think about the messaging, and this is really what we saw. This is my big takeaway from
is that Republicans are really good messengers? No?
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to stop laughing from that. There was such a failure. I mean, there was such a failure in messaging, and there has been for the last 6 years.
Give our listeners some examples of what you're talking about.
Well, okay. Before I even do that, let's just talk about it. Messaging is branding, right? Messaging is all about the brand. Let's talk about what branding is. So many times people think, okay, the brand is the Nike swoosh. The brand is the Air Jordan logo. The brand is the Apple, right? The little icon.
Right.
You a lot of times businesses will call a designer and say, hey, I need a new brand. Will you draw a new logo for me? And they think that's the brand.
Right.
Branding, from anybody who has experience in that area, will tell you branding has a lot less to do with the actual icon. And rather we define it as the emotional connection somebody makes to your business, product, organization, or you as a person, right? You have a brand, I have a brand, we all have brands. And it's what's the emotional response? We are emotional beings. I think it's hard to deny that.
Yep.
And when somebody says, if I'm walking down the street and I say, hey, you know that guy Kranowiter? What is the feeling that sweeps through them? Is it a feeling of, yeah, that was awesome. I heard him lecture once and that was just right. Amazing. Or he's a little bit too much of a libertarian type for me. Or
well, what the point is, whatever it is, right? And it could be someone I hate him. He's smug and arrogant. Whatever it is,
that's usually me, by the way.
Those emotional responses people have. I mean, that would be my brand,
right?
And then the question is, if I don't like what the brand is, if I think, wow, that's how people feel about me, then it's on me to try to change my brand, right? I got to go do something if I want people to have a better feeling about me. And I'm using that word feeling here quite purposefully because you're describing an emotional experience. It's on me to do something different, behave differently, speak differently, do something to try to change my brand.
So the brand being that emotional connection also has a lot to do with audience, understanding who your audience is, what do they want from you, how are you giving it to them, why are you giving it to them, and why should they trust you to give it to them? And then you take all of that into consideration. You take all of those ideas into consideration, and you go back and you think, how am I talking about it? Am I talking about it in a way that is positive, that is active, that is, I am telling you my brand is this. If you support me, if you like me, if you react positively to me, it's because I've given you something that you like. I'm telling you something that you're in favor of.
You know, you're kind of speaking in abstract terms now.
Okay,
properly so. You're defining these concepts, and you know a lot about this. Before we turn to politicians and political parties, I think it might be helpful. Would you give us an example of a brand that's not political? Maybe it's Apple or a car, or
I think Apple's
something
the
like
perfect
that.
one.
Okay.
We'll start with Apple, and I'm going to do a car too. Obviously, I worked in that space for a while. I know that space as well. But for Apple is a brand in which they say, here's what we give you. Here's something active. We're not them and we're not them and we're not them. It's, we give you a product that we believe is high quality, that we hope you do too. Most people, when they think about Apple, they think it's a quality build. It doesn't feel cheap. When you touch the keyboard, when you look at the screen, when you actually hold it in your hands, you don't feel like you have a cheap product.
Right.
The iOS software is generally very, very good. The customer service has been very good for years now. There's challenges to brands all the time, right? You see brands all the time start to lose brand equity. They people think less of it as they fail to follow through on those promises. And we saw that for a while under Tim Cook. Customer service got bad. Apple stores got so crowded. Getting in to see the Genius Bar, the experts to help fix your products, you started to see those things. But I still think back to the PC. I think we've talked about this in the past. My mother and my stepfather were both teachers. And for years, Apple gave discounts to teachers.
Right.
So I grew up on Apple computers. Growing up on Apple computers, that's what I got used to. I got my first PC when I went off to college. You couldn't get Microsoft Word or Microsoft Office for a Mac, and I wanted Word, and I wanted I wanted Word, PowerPoint, and Excel in college. So I got a PC. And all I think about every time is that blue screen of death.
That frozen blue screen.
And everybody knows what you're talking about when you talk about the blue screen of death. And that's what I associate a PC brand with. I don't care if it was Gateway or Dell or anything else. It's this operating system that wasn't very user-friendly, you had to be kind of a computer guy to figure out your way how to use that. And I was more interested in just sitting and writing. I was more interested in creating than I was trying to code or trying to play with the actual computer.
I'm old enough, Dave. I can remember when, and I'm serious about this, you would open up a PC and you had to start typing things like C:/ to get it to do what you wanted it to do.
Remember, we had those in school, and I sat there thinking, I'm really happy I have an Apple at home.
Yeah.
The other part of it was, so that's the Apple example. Another book I could recommend for people who want to understand branding better, and I don't want to go too far down this hole, but Gatorade. Gatorade, despite having been around for years and having massive company. I mean, think about it.
You're talking about the drink, the sports drink.
Correct.
Yeah, right.
Think about like Coca-Cola bought Powerade and said, we're gonna go dominate. Coca-Cola, unlimited budget.
Right.
Gatorade has still maintained, as of the writing of this book, which was years ago, but had still maintained over 90% market share despite Coke buying Powerade and going after them.
What is the book you're referencing?
It's called First and Thirst by Darren Ravel.
Okay.
Darren Ravel, I don't know where he is now. For a long time, he was the sports business guy on ESPN. So he was the guy who was reporting on contracts and sponsorship deals. Then he went to CNBC. And this was all kind of before everything went so political.
Yeah.
But Darren Ravel was a great writer. And Darren Ravel wrote this book, First and Thirst. And he talks about how Gatorade kept market share by maintaining their brand and building on their brand and making sure that everybody knew we're never going to stop being this innovative company about hydration. Mm-hmm. Our goal, our brand is you will always be hydrated by drinking Gatorade, and we're going to keep innovating every day, to the point that I don't know if people have seen this in the last year. Gatorade has come out with a competitor to Pedialyte. For those who know
Gatorade
Pedialyte, well, Pedialyte has become more popular among young adults than it has among kids as a hangover cure.
After they drink too much.
Yes. It's also became very, very popular during COVID. When people got COVID and they became very dehydrated, Pedialyte was a savior. And when I got sick, I couldn't eat for days. And Pedialyte was the best thing ever for me. So Gatorade has now entered into that space. The third one I'll give is the cars, right? You have your cars that are commuter cars, a Ford, a Chevy. Our goal is to get you from point A to point B. Ford kind of has that brand of we're the tough built car. They're more about their trucks than they are their cars. I worked for BMW. BMW's philosophy was we're going to make fairly plain looking cars, at least when I was there, fairly plain looking, everyday commuter cars that drive better than anything you're ever going to sit in. And you're going to feel the exhilaration of driving. We called it the ultimate driving machine.
Right.
You sit in that car. We had a philosophy. If I get somebody to drive a BMW for 10 miles, they're never going to want to drive another car again. And that's all we did. We went around the country and we gave people opportunities to drive BMWs for 10 miles. That was our goal every single time. And then you've got things like Hyundai who just say, look, we're building a cool looking car that has some nice features and it's not very expensive. And that's their brand. That's branding is essentially, what is that emotional feeling? For BMW, it was, I love driving this car. For Gatorade, it's, I feel refreshed. I feel rehydrated. For Apple, it's, I feel like I have a quality product that I can rely on, that if something breaks, they're going to take care of me. It's going to be well made. It's going to be well manufactured, and it's going to last me a long time.
Is it fair to say that with some of these brands like Apple, there's also sort of a social aspect to it? Like you feel like you're part of a community.
Sure.
Even though you're not, you kind of feel like you're in a club with like-minded people.
It can be. Sometimes that's part of it. I wouldn't wouldn't say Gatorade is part of that. I don't think anybody looks at
like a Harley Davidson,
Harley,
right?
Harley
you drive
Davidson
a Harley Davidson motorcycle. There's a kind of culture around that.
And cars and automotive, that's been the case forever, right?
Yeah.
You have Harley, you have the BMW Drivers Club, you've got you meet a Porsche person, you know that they love their Porsche. Another example of that, CrossFit, right? You meet somebody who does CrossFit or is on the keto diet. Right. They love to tell you about how wonderful CrossFit is or how wonderful the keto diet is and why everybody else should do that.
Right.
They become brand ambassadors for you, right? They understand what you are. They understand what the benefits of what you're offering is. They buy into it. They believe in it, and they want to go promote it to other people.
And you don't even have to pay them to do that.
So now let's turn that to politics. The Democrats have done a phenomenal job of this. As much as I don't agree with their brand, they've convinced enough people that their brand is good, and they've stuck to their brand repeatedly.
What is, so I'm going to ask you a question. It might seem silly. It's so basic, but what is the brand of the Democratic Party? And I say this, I think for myself, someone like me, it's kind of hard to see the brand because I've spent my entire adult life studying history, including political history and the history of the party. So I know a lot about the Democratic Party beyond whatever they show me in ads and little bullet points. So when I think of the Democratic Party, right, I think that this is the party of slavery and Jim Crow and progressivism and fascism and central planning, right? And that's what the Democratic Party has been about, well, for nearly 2 centuries. But most Americans don't have this context of 2 centuries of the Democratic Party. What's the brand for ordinary Americans of the Democratic Party?
I'm going to start by answering that by going back to something we were just talking about. You drink a Gatorade. Do you know that you're rehydrated? Do you know that you're refreshed? How much of that is in your head? How much of that is, well, I just had a Gatorade, so I'm getting my fluid intake and I got those electrolytes, right? I hate that I'm bringing this up the day after an election, but it's that movie, Idiocracy.
Yeah, right.
When they're watering their plants with some sports drink with electrolytes. It's their version of a Gatorade. Right. And the plants are all dying. And they're saying, yeah, but it has electrolytes and that's supposed to hydrate. Electrolytes are salt. So when you're putting salt on plants, the plants are all going to die. I mean, this is so basic,
right?
And it should be universal knowledge, but
it's not.
It's not. And they think, well, if it's supposed to hydrate me, wouldn't it hydrate the plants better? Mm-hmm. And they start putting this version. I wish I remembered what their sports drink was, but they're putting it in water fountains. They're putting it in sinks. You're brushing your teeth with this stuff.
Right.
Never mind all the sugar in it and everything else. That's a little bit like the Democratic Party to me. The Democratic Party is out there telling you, we care about you. We care about the individual. We care about your vote. We care about your reproductive rights. And I want everybody who's listening and not watching, I use air quotes there. Those are not rights, but they like to call them rights. Mm-hmm. This goes back to FDR telling everybody, I have beat this horse over and over and over again, but it's so important. In FDR's 44th State of the Union, talking about if we elect a Republican, we will have defeated fascism overseas and we will have lost to it at home.
Yeah.
They have maintained that message over and over and over and over again to the point that people actually believe it, and to the point that they're actually calling Republicans the fascists.
Yeah.
When I don't even know that anybody knows what that word means. They just associate it with, well, Hitler was a fascist, so I probably shouldn't vote for one.
Right.
And they have convinced this country on a large part that their brand is anti-fascism, that their brand is we're going to take care of the weakest, most vulnerable individuals. Never mind their perception or their attitude towards who those are incredibly racist. I don't know if you saw Joe Biden made a speech at one of the historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs, over the weekend or late last week, where he said, every single one of you is just as smart and just as talented as anybody at any white school.
Right.
What president actually says that? I mean, it's the most racist,
Sure,
awful thought. And then they talk about, we care about your health because we want to guarantee you abortions, and we care about your.
I mean, I've pointed this out. In fact, I've written about this recently. There's a huge overlap there. White supremacists will say people with dark skin and others, right, are inferior. And then progressives agree. I mean, progressives come out and say, oh, well, they can't possibly get an ID. I mean, look at the color of their skin.
Yes.
How can they get an ID, right? It's that same sort of demeaning, racist, but they do a very good job of sliding past that racism and presenting it as some form of, we really care about you.
Exactly. And that's their brand. We care about you. They actually have convinced people that they care about the individual. They care about to a certain extent, they're actually convincing people that they care about the Constitution, that they care about the ideas of this country, that they care
about the environment.
They care about the environment and our resources.
Yeah.
Their other brand is that they don't think it's appropriate. They talk about fairness, that anybody has money in this country. It reminds me a lot of the Roman Church in the 400s and the 900s.
There's this interesting caveat. Part of that democratic brand is it's not right for private individuals, especially non-progressive private individuals, to have a lot of money. But certainly those same progressives will say the government should have a lot of money.
Right.
I mean, that's okay.
And that's why they say they should be in the government, because that justifies Nancy Pelosi having nice houses and Bernie Sanders having multiple houses and AOC is now dating a billionaire. And I mean, all of these things, right? They are allowed to have the money because they're going to do good things with it. And that's their brand. And they've convinced a lot of people of that. Now flip it to the other side. What is the Republican brand? The Republican brand is everything the Democrats are doing is destroying this country. That's the Republican brand. You can't listen to the Democrats. Look at all the bad things that they've done. But I didn't hear once throughout this entire campaign season,
right?
I didn't hear one Republican come out and say, here's why capitalism is good, both morally and effectively. It's morally good for this reason. And it actually results in a positive net gain for our society. It makes society better. Look at the thoughts and ideas that come out of free markets.
Yeah, I mean, there's even a more personal way that could be presented, and that is, let me start with this premise. I care about you. Yeah. I care about you, and I don't want to see you struggle. I want to see you have more of the things you want, and you know how you can get that? You can get it through free enterprise, and right, free markets and productivity. I promote those things not because I'm cold-hearted and callous. The opposite. I like to see people thrive.
And the problem, though, is the Democrats for decades, generations, have convinced people that those two things are incompatible.
Right.
That human thriving and free markets are absolutely incompatible. And for that reason, the Republicans can say that all they want, but it doesn't actually result in, people don't believe that will actually result in those positive gains.
It's fascinating. We actually have a very good friend and a member here who likes to emphasize that you can only get away so long telling lies and pretending that unreal things are real, right? And the opposite. And I like to think that he's right. I want to think that he's right. And yet sometimes I really question this, because what you're saying right now, it's true. This is what has happened. Progressives and Democrats have done this in a modern era that has witnessed the greatest tyrannical regimes in all of history, the greatest mass murders that rack up into the millions, right? We're not talking about just a few dead people here. No, millions. And yet there has been this very successful brand of, when people are free and productive and can trade with whomever they want to and do what they want to, that somehow is bad for them. You need this central planning, this supervision, this bureaucratic kind of engineering of society. You need experts telling you what you're going to learn in school, what you're going to do at work, how you're going to raise your kids, right? All these details, even though that bureaucratic central planning is what led to the tyrannical regimes. That's how we got all those murders.
It's interesting because from that perspective, I think back to Obama's "Yes, we can" mantra, right? You never heard him say, "You can." It was never, "Yeah, you can."
Right.
It was, "You can't, but we can." It was this come together. And it might not be great it might not be great, but it's going to be better for everybody in the long run. And everybody kind of bought into that. Whereas in all those regimes you talked about, never worked out that way. It just put everybody down at the bottom with some oligarchs and some dictators and some friends of the king, whatever you want to call them.
There's always an elite class who's enjoying, all the riches while everyone else suffers.
So you pose a question on Facebook this week.
Yeah.
And I think we should close with that because it relates to all of these branding questions. And that question was, is the Republican brand something that can still be won?
Yep.
Is the Republican brand that anybody still wants to embrace?
Is it worth having a Republican? Should we have a Republican Party? Should we not? If we, is the Republican Party, is it more of an asset or a liability when it comes to like winning an election?
And it's a really, really hard question to answer. I've said to you before, and you've effectively convinced me that he had something to do with it, but I'm still not convinced that the Republican brand has ever actually won anybody an election.
Who's the he?
The he is Lincoln.
Oh,
right.
Yeah, right.
Lincoln ran as a Republican, and the Republican platform was we're going to end slavery. Right. That's number one priority. Number one, we're going to fulfill the objectives of the founders, and we're going to end slavery in America. That whether it was crystal clear and spoken so precisely as that, or if it was a little more esoteric, it still was the purpose.
Just to give a little context here, a couple of really important things happened that made all that possible, that made it possible to have a party of Lincoln. Number one is, and I won't go in the weeds on this, I talk about this in other places, but a guy named Stephen Douglas, he ushered through a really important piece of legislation, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And here's all you need to know about it. It opened the doors legally. It let slavery spread to all the Western territories.
Mm-hmm.
You remember Americans had bought this huge chunk of land that Louisiana purchased. We had all this big open territory out in the West, and that law let slavery go everywhere. The Republican Party was born out of opposition to that law.
Right.
We don't want slavery spreading everywhere. We want to stop the spread of slavery. The other thing is the Republican Party was a new party.
Yep.
It was only a few years old. Lincoln is the first successful candidate who gets elected president. He is the first Republican president. And so Lincoln can sort of craft and shape and influence the party. He can take some claim for what the party is. That's easier to do than future presidents and other influential people, because at some point the party becomes old and it gets a history. When Lincoln was elected, there wasn't much of a history to the Republican Party.
So even still, he or the people with him start to establish the Republican brand.
Right.
You can't argue that the Republican brand helped him win. And even to a certain extent, Lincoln himself didn't get a majority of the votes, right? Let's not forget.
Right.
And you've effectively persuaded me that Lincoln convinced enough of the Democrats that Stephen A. Douglas was enough of a pro-abolitionist to split the Democrat vote in this country and to actually get 2 Democrats into the election.
Yep.
But that was a move by Lincoln and some of his guys. That had nothing to do with the Republican Party,
right,
as it sits.
Right.
The Republican Party didn't necessarily win that election in some landslide. It wasn't some mandate from the country saying, hey, we want to get rid of slavery. And it was 39% of the vote?
Yep, that's right.
So how do you sit there and say, well, okay, so Lincoln sets this brand and this mandate for for republicanism. The next guy to come along who really did it well and who understood these same ideas of the Republican brand, we've talked about, and I still say is one of the least known presidents.
Calvin Coolidge.
Is Calvin Coolidge, right? This guy who actually understood the founding, who actually understood why the Republican Party was formed and what he wanted it to represent. And he still remains one of the least known, arguably least impactful good presidents we've ever had. You had Teddy Roosevelt, who so many people associate with the Republican brand. Teddy Roosevelt ends up becoming a progressive, runs against the party as a blue moose.
Progressive.
Right. What was the line? Woodrow Wilson is insufficiently progressive. Right. But you probably had a whole bunch of Republicans who didn't understand what is the Republican brand.
Right.
I just really like Teddy Roosevelt. He did some great things. He wasn't a Republican. I mean, in the sense of what the Lincoln brand was, things like national parks and all of that are far from an idea of the founders.
Roosevelt, in a way, I mean, is fascinating because he really fosters this cult of personality. He's a huge personality. Yeah. It's hard not to like him as a person. Sure. This is funny, loud, gregarious, guy who would go out and hunt bears and be carrying, bears. I mean, right. He was this active, energetic guy. He attracted a lot of attention and support because of his personality, but not because he's upholding the principles of Lincoln and the Declaration of Independence.
So now you start to see this erosion of the Lincoln brand of republicanism.
Right.
We still have no real clue of what it is. And then along comes 64, and you have a bunch of people who say they're Republican, right? I mean, Martin Luther King was a Republican, and
you're talking about 1964.
Did I say 1864?
No, you just said 64. Oh, I'm just clarifying. 1964.
1964. You have a lot of the Black community. A lot of others are Republican. There's no real clear understanding of what the brand is.
Yep.
You've just dealt with going back to me pointing out that FDR says voting for a Republican is voting for a fascist.
Mm-hmm.
And along comes Barry Goldwater, who probably more than anybody other than Coolidge since Lincoln understood the founding, comes out and they say, see, we told you Republicans are racist. Mm-hmm. We told you Republicans are fascist. He doesn't want to help you. He doesn't want to be there for you. And that might have been Goldwater's biggest failure, is Goldwater failed to explain how his policies and how his positions could actually help people.
I think we're going to have to, continue this conversation on because we're going to run out of time here. One of the great challenges in political branding is when you have one party, one group, one organization who is continuously and frequently introducing something new that allegedly helps people. Set aside the truth that it doesn't. It only helps the crony political. But set that aside. The brand is, hey, we have these programs. If you're unemployed, we have a program for you. If you're losing your house, we have a program for you, right? If you can't send your kids to school, we have a program for you because we care about you. To oppose that is arguably one of the greatest branding challenges, right? And this is the conundrum Goldwater finds himself in. Democrats went within a few years. I mean, sort of the emblematic, iconic figure here is Lyndon Johnson, went from just denouncing Black Americans in the ugliest terms and saying, I'm not voting for any, black bills. He didn't use the word black, but nothing like that. Within just a few years, flips completely and says, oh, well, it looks like we have to start pandering to Black Americans. So we'll create this 1964 Civil Rights Act that secretly gives the federal government all kinds of control over private property and private businesses. But hey, we're going to call it a Civil Rights Act that's good for Black people. And there's Barry Goldwater in the position. He's going to oppose it. Because for good reasons. It's unconstitutional. It does all kinds of bad, nefarious things. But there they are saying, we're offering this because we care. And they brand their policies as synonymous with caring. So to oppose their policies, well, that must mean you don't care.
I know we're running out of time, but I can't move past what you just said without pointing out what just happened last week with Michael Bennett's wife. So for those who were in Colorado, you know Bennett well. Bennett's now known on a national stage after running for president, and he's been a senator. Now he's going to be a 2-term or 3-term senator. Michael Bennett's wife was at a backyard party. I don't know what it was for. I don't know if it was a campaign stop or whatever else. Somebody pulled out their phone, held it down by their side, and filmed her. And they had a whole conversation with her. I don't know if you saw any of this. And she talked exactly what you were saying. She said, here's the 2 things that we do well. She says, 1, the things that we get done in DC that are the most important, you never hear about because we make sure the media never hears about them. We do everything we can to keep them away from the media because we just want to get things done, and we don't want to have to justify as why it's good for people. The things that the media does know about, we have to brand them in a way. We have to talk about them in a way that make people think that we're helping them. And she goes straight to the Inflation Reduction Act. She says, we talked about it as inflation, and it had nothing to do with inflation. It was our way of getting Green New Deal ideas through. It was our way of getting bigger government through. She full on admits everything that they accomplished by just telling people we're here to help you.
You could almost, this is a little bit of this is a bad analogy, but it makes the point. Take an image of the cutest little fluffy puppy that you can imagine, right? And everything the Democrats do, they could just cover it with that little fluffy puppy and say, see, this is about a fluffy puppy. Mm-hmm. And therefore, if you oppose it, you're saying you hate the fluffy puppy. You want to attack the fluffy puppy, don't you? And that is a great challenge in terms of branding strategy. How do you oppose the fluffy puppy?
and Trump was the bigger dog that scared the fluffy puppy away, made the fluffy puppy. This is kind of inappropriate. I was going to say, made the fluffy puppy poop itself and not be so cute for the moment.
Right.
And it worked for a short time. And now it probably is time for him to move on, because he has inspired a whole group of people who are willing to fight, who actually might know a little bit more about how to fight for freedom. The problem is I'm still not convinced that any of them know how to actually message. That the best thing that DeSantis had going for him was he could say, look at my record.
Yeah.
He didn't have to go convince people that all of these things worked. He said, look at Florida's economy. Look at this about Florida. Look at that about Florida. We are in a great place compared to the rest of the country. Let's not lose that. That's the way of convincing people. Otherwise, if you can't message it.
Well, Dave, in the interest of respecting the time of our audience, we should probably wind down. I'm going to say this. This is a bigger conversation. And I think we should continue this conversation about branding in a general sense, branding for the Republican Party, because if we could get Republicans to pay attention to a few of the key insights we have to offer, it could be a game changer for the Republican Party.
It could be. I hope people are willing to listen. I hope people are willing to explore some new things, because what they've been doing for the last several decades isn't working anymore.
Yeah, it's true. Until then, we're going to keep guarding, protecting the American idea, and trying to inspire people, encourage them to be proud of the principles of liberty they stand for. That's what we're all about.
No somos custodes.